Welcome to the first video of Chapter 19 of By the People. In this video we're going to talk about Utopians and Muckrakers and kind of the intellectual reaction to the Gilded Age. Remember the Gilded Age being a time of great wealth and prosperity for the country and the industrialists, but at its heart was a very poor and struggling society. What you can see there is a picture by Jacob Riis of the New York tenements. He was a writer and photographer who showed kind of the living conditions of the immigrant and inner city poor. So let's get right onto it. So we're going to start off with some literature that kind of described kind of what was going on in the late 1800s. We're going to start off with Henry George, who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And his main emphasis was that while there was a lot of good that came from industrialization and the new increased manufacturing, there was a lot that came with that was negative for the working class and for the large group of people. Edward Bellamy wrote a book about 9 years later called Looking Backward. And in that, he described a utopian society free of class and politics. I want to point out that utopian societies is like this perfect society, and when you get utopian writing, a lot of it is actually what's called dystopian writing, where it describes a situation where they're trying to create a utopia or a perfect world, but in essence, it becomes anything but that. And by describing utopia, you really are highlighting what is wrong in the modern time. Going on to Ignatius Donnelly, he wrote Caesar's Column in 1891, and here he just kind of highlighted the divide or the division between the large working class and the comfortable, wealthy elite and the prosperous in their life of leisure. Now, from these writings, a couple things emerge, and one of those is Henry George himself, who we just talked about in his book Progress and Poverty, and he had an idea he called 100% tax on the single tax movement, and it's 100% tax on all increased value in land. In other words, if land increases in value, 100% of that increase would go to the government. What this would do is it's going to prevent land value from increasing, and then make it more affordable for people to actually buy land. Okay. Now, if more people can buy the land, that means then people who might be laborers might decide, you know what, there's affordable land, maybe I'll become a farmer. If more laborers become farmers, that means there's going to be less laborers to fill the jobs in the factories, which is going to create a demand for laborers, and then with an increased demand, that means wages will go up. So he believed that if we create a system where land did not increase in value, right, that more people would have an opportunity for that land, instead of it being focused in the hands of a smaller and smaller group, and that would increase wages and a more profitable society. On the right, you have some quotes from Henry George. Capital is the result of labor and is used by labor to assist in for their production. Labor is the active and initial force, and labor is therefore the employer of capital. Now, as we know, that is not the way society was at the time. In fact, capitalism is the exact opposite. So he's putting out some ideas that counter what is kind of already out there. Now we have some other intellectual reformers we're going to talk about. First, about John Dewey. John Dewey is a progressive educator. He talked a lot about how education should be more active. It should educate the mind, the body, the soul. He kind of described this idea as the teacher of a facilitator of knowledge and not just simply someone who gave out facts and information. And he believed that it was the school's job to educate someone ready to fit into society. But he did some more. The book tells a story about how he was on a train bound for Chicago, where he's going to take a job as a professor, and the trains weren't going because of the Pullman strike. And he talked to a couple people there. One of them was a union reformer. One of them was someone upset that he couldn't get home for dinner. And when he listened to the union reformer talk about changes to society and how improvements need to be made so we could become a better nation and society, and he listened to the guy complain about it for the sole fact that he wasn't getting his dinner, he realized that there must be more noble goals for the reform. He sided with the union activist who had better intentions. With that, he opposed ideas such as social Darwinism, which was the economic theory of the time. The idea of social Darwinism is the idea that you have those who are fit to survive. Okay, those are the wealthy capitalists, and those who really don't have the capabilities to survive in the economic world, and those are your laborers. And I believe that the disparity in wealth, the rich and the poor, was justified because it really just showed who was more able to succeed and who was less able to succeed. And they felt that any disruption of that natural order would cause economic difficulties and turbulence. And John Dewey did not agree with that at all. He felt that wise people should intervene in the economy, and that when wise people intervened, it was to create a more just system. In other words, that there would be kind of less difference between the wealthy and the poor, that you were taking care of those who needed extra help. Right? It wasn't that poor laborers were poor laborers because they didn't have the ability, it's they didn't have the opportunity. And that's a big difference. Okay, a couple others that we're going to mention are Richard Ely. He had visited Pullman town before the Pullman strikes and noticed it was rather oppressive, and he compared it to feudalism. So what he recognized is that there was Pullman, who's kind of an overlord over these people who depended on him for their jobs and for their living situation, right? In that, in other words, all you did is you lived on his land and then paid him exactly back, and that you were just kind of allowed to survive while he made all the profit off of it. Albion Small was a early professor of sociology, which was kind of a new intellectual movement at the time and intellectual study, and he felt that sociologists should not just study society, but also using that knowledge should try to reform it and improve it. So at this time, go ahead and take a second to describe the issues raised by the utopians and intellectuals of the 19th century. So what were some of the problems that you see described in their writing? All right, moving on to kind of the muckraker period. We're going to talk about two newspaper men. When I say newspaper men, I'm talking about not necessarily the writers, but the people who owned the newspapers. The first one being Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer owned some New York newspapers, and he became very successful using things like political cartoons, having big banner headlines, as you can see there, smashes Spain, right? Big headlines to get people's attention. But specifically what we want to get into is investigative journalism. Having journalists, having writers who would really spend time researching and getting involved and finding out the details that are kind of trying to be kept hidden, find those things out and expose them. And he had a big expose on life insurance corruption in New York and how much of a gamble it was to have money invested in these companies or to invest it in your life insurance, and how this money was being used. And because of that, there was a lot of voting to support people who would reform life insurance, and there was laws put in place. So what it showed was that the power of good investigative journalism would be that you could change the laws once people became aware of what was going on. William Randolph Hearst saw the success that Pulitzer was having with this, and he, in his own newspapers, decided to focus on just investigative journalism. He started in San Francisco, but also bought some newspapers in New York and Boston and other cities. He also owned and operated Cosmopolitan magazine, which was set up to do investigative journalism and this type of writing. Just a little side note, William Randolph Hearst. There's Hearst Castle out in California. It's a wonderful visit if you get a chance to go. It's a several-hour drive from here. And then also, if you ever get to see the movie Citizen Kane, which is considered to be one of the greatest movies of all time, it is based on the life of William Randolph Hearst. So anyway, just throwing that out there. S.S. McClure also started McClure's Magazine, which became the highlight on the highest regarded investigative journalism magazine in the country. Now, the group of writers who did this reporting were called muckrakers. This idea that muck being the filth, the dung of society, and they're raking it up. In other words, they were criticized for showing kind of the problems, but never really doing anything to try to resolve it, right? It's just like, here is the crap our society is dealing with. There's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt with his rake in the Senate, and the kind of the corruption going on. Now, here are some of the muckrakers that you would want to know about. Henry Demerset Lloyd, he was an early muckraker. He dealt with a lot of the Chicago strikes in the late 1800s. He also did some writing on Standard Oil, which was owned by John D. Rockefeller, and he did a lot of. He wrote a book about the danger of monopolies, right? And so you're going to start to see the progressives, this political movement that comes out of this, do a lot more to kind of deal with the problems of monopolies. Ida M. Tarbell, she wrote about Standard Oil. She is from my hometown of Titusville, Pennsylvania. That's right. All right. So she wrote about Standard Oil and kind of some of the corruption within that company and the policies and economic methods used by John Rockefeller to show that he wasn't such a good guy. Ray Stannard Baker talked about the plight of coal miners. Lincoln Steffens wrote about political corruption in Minneapolis and how there was specifically a mayor in Minneapolis who received a lot of kickbacks. Kickbacks would be when you give a government contract with an agreement that they would secretly give you some money for that contract. He was involved. This mayor was also involved in a lot of like brothels and a lot of not so good businesses. And so in his writing, he exposed a lot of this corruption, right? So as you can see, there's a lot of writing to try to let people know what's really going on, that most people had no idea what was going on with their politics and with the business out there. Probably the most well-known muckraker, though, is a guy named Upton Sinclair, and he wrote a book called The Jungle. Now, The Jungle is about the meat packing industry. And so he took a job at a meat packing factory in Chicago to expose the working conditions. He was trying to show how difficult and how terrible it was for the workers in these factories. He wrote about just terrible working conditions that they had to deal with. Cold weather, people losing arms and losing limbs and losing fingers, and just terrible stuff, right? But he said that I aimed to hit the heart of the American public, but I hit the stomach instead. Meaning that they read about the working conditions, weren't overly moved by those conditions, but they were disgusted to find out how the food that they were eating was being packaged and treated before it got to them. Finding out that human factory workers had lost their fingers and arms ripped off, and then just that became part of the meat that they were eating. It wasn't like it just was terrible sounding. Now, this book had such a huge impact that even politicians who did not favor the muckrakers decided that something had to be done, and they passed the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So with this book, what Upton Sinclair was able to do was really show that there was something behind the wall, something behind the veil, something there that people didn't know, and it was really important to let them know what was going on. And so you're going to see investigative journalism in books and newspaper articles that involve investigative journalism really take off, because it's an important aspect of making sure that people know what's really going on. Okay? So with that, please do checking for understanding. B, describe why you believe muckraking journalism was so popular. All right. Thank you. Have a good night.